You won't need to spend much time in Possum Springs to see that the town is devoid of effective authority figures. The city council bickers over Ferris wheels and snowplows, while a murder cult targets the most vulnerable members of the town. Aunt Molly, try as she might, is unable to solve a mystery that's far above her pay grade, a case that, honestly, calls for the skills of John Constantine or Harry Dubois. Even aside from occupational authority, Possum Springs doesn't have any true pillars of the community. People like Irma from Fall of Porcupine, who have earned the respect of their fellow citizens thanks to their venerable reputation. It's a grim reality that, in all honesty, is just as bleak as the town's declining job market and the horde of young people trying to move away. Communities aren't just places where people eat, sleep, and work. They're not just collections of buildings and street grids. They're the homes we grow up in, the schools where we discover our careers, and the places of worship in which we explore life's greater meaning. But to make those columns of civilization more than just a smattering of bricks and mortar, you need people. Good people. People willing to go beyond the call of duty and do what's right, even when it's neither easy nor popular. People like Pastor K. Throughout Night in the Woods, Pastor K stands out as an example of positive and compassionate authority to the people of Possum Springs. Someone willing to do everything she can to protect the town's most needy at a time when everyone from government officials to secret cults are deliberately targeting them. Honest about even her own doubts, she provides us with a look at the transformative, community-building work the administrators of organized religion can do when they truly adhere to the values of their institutions. But before I go on, if you are a Night in the Woods fan, then please be sure to like, subscribe, and consider supporting me with a YouTube channel membership or over on Patreon. My dream is to make these videos full-time someday, and by doing any of those things, you'll be helping make that dream a reality. Unlike most of the supporting characters of Night in the Woods, we don't meet Pastor K until day 4, when the construction crew finishes work on the stairs leading up to the church. I love how new areas of the game unlock like this as you progress, and that construction is the narrative reason for it. Here in Pennsylvania, there's always construction, and of course, Possum Springs is no different. Our initial meeting with Pastor K tells us so much about her. She's not just hanging out outside the church, she's out doing work to benefit her community. We find her behind the statue of Saint Rebello, checking in on Bruce, making sure he's okay, and asking him if he needs anything. After a brief introduction, Pastor K will tell us that she's new to Possum Springs. Well, new to May, at least. She's been here for 16 months, meaning that she likely arrived shortly before our protagonist left. This alone makes her stand out amongst the other characters, all of whom have lived in Deep Hollow County for their entire lives. Naturally, this allows her to bring a fresh set of eyes and a new energy to her work here in Possum Springs, and from then on, Pastor K spends the majority of the game doing everything she can to help Bruce. When she's not talking with him near his tent, she's trying to urge the city council to establish a homeless shelter. On day 6, May can find her talking with the council inside the church, suggesting that they set one up in the basement or the library. The council is polite, but somewhat dismissive of her ideas in this meeting, foreshadowing the futility of her efforts. Unfortunately, the city council ultimately decides against her plan. They inform Pastor K of their decision on day 10, a few hours before the vote is set to take place, in an infuriating conversation in which they go to great lengths to dehumanize Bruce and brand him as a danger to the community. Pastor K argues with them, says they have a duty to help the needy people of Possum Springs, but the council is unmoved. Bruce is not at all surprised by this turn of events, and if May visits him at his campsite, they'll have what is probably one of the most heavily discussed conversations in the entire game. In it, Bruce announces his intention to leave town, to return home to his family. Many have speculated that he isn't actually talking about leaving town at all, but rather alluding to his intention to take his own life. I'll be covering this in greater detail in Bruce's own video, which will drop next month. But for now, Let's just stick to the facts. Bruce knows that Pastor K is going to lose the vote, says he's going to leave, and the following morning, he's gone. It's May who breaks this unfortunate news to Pastor K. She's furious that he left, but thanks May for letting her know. Again, many have taken her response here as evidence that she thinks that Bruce might have committed suicide, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was because she had been working on a backup plan for him all along. Because, to her credit, even in the lead up to the vote on Bruce's situation, it seems that Pastor K tries about everything in her power to find a solution that will be agreeable to the council. If May explores the building that contains Mallard's tomb to its fullest extent, she'll find a hidden room that many suspect Pastor K was setting up for Bruce. This room was added along with the Weird Autumn edition, so if you haven't seen it, that's probably why. There's not much hard proof to this theory, especially considering that Pastor K usually brings up the church basement as her suggested place for Bruce to stay. But given that this room opens up around the time she's making the pitch to set up a place for him in town, and closes after the vote takes place and Bruce leaves, it's a solid guess. Personally, my theory is that she set up this room as a backup plan, as a somewhat hidden and secluded spot for Bruce to stay in the likely event the council voted against them. But with Bruce gone, she no longer had any need of the room, and thus locked it up. Regardless of how it turned out, or what really happened to Bruce, Pastor K's story arc throughout Night in the Woods centers around her attempts to better the community by helping those who are in need, in this case, a homeless person. Unlike the city council, who waste their authority by arguing about little things, oppressing the most vulnerable people of Possum Springs, and honestly, acting more like a petty, uptight HOA than a governing body, she spends the game trying to use her authority for a tremendous act of charity. It's ironic that Pastor Kate isn't originally from Possum Springs. The city council loves to talk about how much they want to attract new members to their community, and yet they shut down the ideas of someone who just recently moved to the town. Pastor K is a hard-working contributor, exactly the type of people they're hoping to bring to Possum Springs. And rather than value the ways she wants to improve the town to build up her new community, they dehumanize the person she's trying to help. "Please come to Possum Springs and contribute to a hard-working community," says the city council. "Just not like that." It's also worth mentioning that although we don't know much about the religions of Night in the Woods, the Church of Possum Springs is called the Church of the First Coalescence. Coalescence means the joining or merging of elements to form one mass or whole. So presumably, the idea of bringing people together of various backgrounds and walks of life is one of the central ideas of Pastor K's faith. Trying to support Bruce is certainly an example of this, and in doing so, I feel pretty confident in saying that she's not just supporting her community, but living up to the core tenets of her religion as well. She really does practice what she preaches. I think it's also worth mentioning that Pastor K seems to be a really good boss. In a game where everyone from Danny to Stan and even B complain about the way their superiors treat them, we never see Candy say anything of the sort about Pastor K, which again feeds into this theme of her being a positive, compassionate authority figure. Another great thing about Pastor K's approach to her position is her honesty. After the dream where May encounters the Sky Cat, or the Ass Cat as some might call it, May can talk with Pastor K about a variety of topics, including the killer incident, her dreams, and faith itself. This segment comes on the heels of the city council telling her they'll be voting against her resolution to set up a homeless shelter for Bruce, so she's clearly feeling pretty down on herself, and it leads to what is, honestly, one of the most vulnerable and authentic conversations in the entire game. It says a lot about Pastor K that May is willing to share all of this information with her. It's essentially an abridged version of the conversation she has with B or Greg on the couch a few days later. May's honesty leads to a discussion about belief in God, at which point Pastor K will admit that she herself doubts his existence sometimes. She says that everyone doesn't believe in God for at least a few minutes a day, and that on her best days she thinks she believes in his existence, but on her worst days she doesn't. Though some might call Pastor K a hypocrite, as May does here, I personally find her authenticity to be really refreshing. As we'll get into in a minute here, I'm not a religious person, at least not anymore, and one of the things that's always been difficult for me to wrap my head around is the idea of doubtless faith. In my adult years, I've just never really understood how someone could be absolutely certain in their belief in God. The idea of such an ironclad faith in anything seems so alien to me, and while I know that even the most devout worshippers have crises of faith, it's good to see someone like Pastor K admitting that it extends up to the clergy as well. It humanizes them, makes them feel more real, more authentic than just some doubtless robot that goes up to the front of the church and reads scripture every Sunday. Of course priests and pastors waver in their beliefs at times. It's just so refreshing to hear someone admit it so openly. If the response to my video on Laurentius told me anything, it's that I need to tell more personal stories in these videos. So I'm going to try and do that again here. As I discussed briefly in my review of I the Inquisitor, I grew up in the Catholic Church. I don't practice anymore. I shift between being an agnostic or an atheist, depending on the day. But when I was a teenager, I spent several years volunteering as an altar server at my local parish. And during that time, I was fortunate enough to develop a positive rapport with several priests. Priests who, looking back, were very much like Pastor K in the way they stood up for what was right, supported their community members, or were very honest about their faith. There was one who was a bit like an extra grandfather to me, and when he was moved to another church, 10-year-old Albatross was heartbroken. I later learned that the Catholic superstructure moved him because he'd refused to promise the parents at the church's connected school that there would always be 2 classes in each grade level, when the number of students at that school was rapidly dwindling. Not a popular thing to do, but certainly honest. I never developed much of a connection with the guy who replaced him, but I'll never forget the way he responded when another altar server asked him if he'd ever thought about getting married. Holding back tears as best he could, he said, "Oh, well, you know, only 2 or 3 times a day." From then on, I noticed that every time he mentioned marriage in one of his homilies, he had to pause to rein in his emotions. It made me really feel for the guy and wish for a world where he didn't have to choose one or the other. When it came time to go to college, I ended up settling on a Catholic university for reasons that were largely unrelated to faith. From the minute I stepped onto campus, I just knew I belonged there. If you've never had that experience, then I sure hope you do someday. There's just nothing like showing up somewhere for the first time and immediately knowing right away that you've found a new place to call home. The people there were just so kind and welcoming, and chief among them was the Irish priest who'd been assigned as a mentor to the School of Education. I've often mentioned that I went through a mental health crisis during my sophomore year of college, and when things were at their worst, it was him I turned to for help. For the next 2.5 years, I visited him every Friday morning. Sometimes just to talk, sometimes to complain about my ex-girlfriend, sometimes just to check in, but often to talk through the many terrible things running through my head. I didn't realize I had anxiety back then, but we always ended each session by doing a prayer that centered around accepting the things we can and cannot change in our lives. And damn, if that wasn't exactly what I needed to hear during that brutal period of my youth. It wasn't long after my return home from college that I stopped going to church, disgusted by the ramblings of a visiting priest who took to the altar to rant about everything from the LGBTQ community to women who had gotten abortions to unmarried couples that lived together. It was completely unhinged and provided the inspiration for my final, climactic broad jump away from Catholic faith that had been happening gradually for several years at that point. I didn't go back to church until my grandmother's funeral in 2019, 5 years since that sermon drove me away. And in that time, my fiancé had moved in with me, and we'd had our first daughter together. One of the church's deacons, who was a bit of a fire and brimstone guy from a theological perspective, welcomed me back with open arms and was incredibly kind to both my fiancé and my daughter, despite the fact that our union and the circumstances of her birth were against Catholic doctrine. But I think the priest who reminds me the most of Pastor K is the one who currently runs the church I grew up at. As I mentioned, I don't go anymore myself, but my mother still does, and has often brought back stories of how she was worried the church was going to move him because of how much he was breaking with traditionalist views. When a high school student from the parish committed suicide in the months before the pandemic, he spoke openly of the mental illness that led her to that point, which isn't something you often hear from a clergyman. And when the Catholic Church encouraged their parishioners to vote against a Pennsylvania law that would remove the statute of limitations on sexual abuse, legislation that would no doubt lead to a slew of new lawsuits and comeuppance for the priests who committed some of the worst crimes imaginable, he did the opposite, urging anyone who would listen to vote their conscience. None of this, of course, makes up for the crimes and corruption of some organized religions. Institutions of faith have helped plenty of people in wonderful ways, but at the same time, a lot of terrible things have been done in the name of God, and many wrongdoings overlooked because they were committed by men who were in charge of congregations. This is true even in the Night in the Woods universe, as evidenced by the story of the fire-breathing cannibalistic Pope Saint Rubello. Nor should my stories of the positive experiences I had with priests be taken as a defense of the Catholic Church. I'm no longer Catholic, and even if I were, those crimes and that corruption would probably be enough for me to keep my young family away from the church. But I do think it's worth acknowledging the clergymen and women of any religion who practice what they preach, who stand up for the vulnerable members of their communities and are honest about their faith, even when it comes to their own doubts. That is the type of person Pastor K is, and that's what makes her so important to Night in the Woods. Thanks for watching. Big thanks to Wolf.Godwin and Jordi Jaen Moreno for providing me with the music for these videos and the art for my channel. Huge shout out to James Pruitt, Raven Lampkin, Corey Matson, Gustavo Balabi, Lil Caesar, Reed, and Pathonian, who receive early access to these videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. See you guys next time.